On the morning of November 15, 2019, 11 experienced hunters entered the pristine wilderness of the Absaroka Beartooth Mountains in southwestern Montana. By sunset that same day, all 11 men lay dead across 14 square miles of frozen forest. All adults, all eliminated with high-powered hunting rifles. The perpetrators, the Whitmore family, patriarch and sons, working with the methodical precision of a military unit. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks would later call it the most systematic rural elimination in Big Sky country history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't poaching, wasn't drug trafficking, wasn't even a decades-old family feud. It was a property boundary dispute over 43 acres of mountainous terrain that had been contested for generations. And one man's unshakable belief that his family's legacy mattered more than human life. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that forever changed a small Montana community. Park County, Montana stretched across 2,813 square miles of some of the most unforgiving wilderness in the northern Rocky Mountains in 2019. The Absaroka Range rose like ancient sentinels along the eastern border, their peaks reaching over 12,000 feet. Their valleys so remote that cell phone coverage disappeared 20 miles from the nearest town. Population stood around 16,000, scattered across ranches, small towns, and hunting lodges that served wealthy clients from across the country during the fall season. November in Park County meant temperatures plummeting to single digits at night, climbing to maybe 35 degrees by mid-afternoon if the wind wasn't howling down from the peaks. The air carried the bite of early winter, mixed with the smell of wood smoke from cabins and lodges preparing for the long Montana winter. Snow had already begun accumulating at higher elevations, turning the landscape into something from a postcard, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. At night, when the temperature dropped and the wind died, you could hear elk bugling across the valleys, the haunting calls echoing off granite cliffs. Sound traveled differently in the thin mountain air. Sometimes you'd hear a rifle shot from 5 miles away, clear as thunder. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you on the frozen ground. But November 2019 was a particularly brutal month for rural Montana. The state's economy remained heavily dependent on agriculture, mining, and seasonal tourism. Small ranching families struggled against corporate agriculture, buying up land at prices no local could match. Traditional ways of life were disappearing as younger generations moved to cities like Bozeman and Billings, leaving behind elderly parents trying to maintain properties their families had worked for a century. In that economic environment, hunting outfitters provided crucial seasonal income. Wealthy clients from New York, California, and Texas paid premium prices for guided elk and deer hunts on private land. A successful hunting operation could generate enough revenue in 3 months to sustain a family for an entire year. But that income required access to prime hunting territory, and in Montana, access meant everything. The boundary dispute that would eventually claim 11 lives had roots stretching back to 1923, when surveyor errors created conflicting property descriptions in the original land patents. Two families, the Whitmores and the Andersons, had been arguing over the same 43 acres of prime hunting land for nearly a century. The disputed territory sat at the confluence of Elk Creek and Bear Canyon, a natural funnel that channeled wildlife movement during migration seasons. Robert James Whitmore was 68 years old that November, though years of ranching in harsh mountain conditions had aged him beyond his years. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, but walked with the slight stoop of a man who'd spent decades building fence in sub-zero temperatures and wrestling cattle in blizzards. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently curved from gripping tools and reins in weather that would send most people indoors. A thick scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, souvenir from a horse wreck in 1987 when a spooked gelding had thrown him into a barbed wire fence. He walked with a pronounced limp, legacy of the same accident that had shattered his hip and required 3 surgeries to repair. When winter storms moved in, that limp became so pronounced his youngest son had to help him climb the steps to their ranch house. Every morning, Robert woke at 4:30, made coffee in a percolator his grandfather had used, black and strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. He'd sit at his kitchen table reading weather reports and livestock market prices, planning his day around conditions that could change from manageable to life-threatening in minutes. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Marlboro Red, and then step outside to check on his cattle, regardless of whether the thermometer read 10 above or 20 below zero. Robert had married Sarah Lynn Hutchins in 1973, right after completing his military service in Vietnam. They'd built their ranch from nothing, starting with 40 head of cattle and a mortgage that consumed every dollar they earned for the first 10 years. Sarah was 65 now, a tough woman whose face had been weathered by wind and sun into something resembling carved leather. She'd buried 3 of her own brothers in mining accidents, watched their small community slowly die as young people left for opportunities elsewhere, and now lived with the constant knowledge that their ranch operation balanced on a knife's edge between survival and bankruptcy. Robert and Sarah had raised 4 sons on the ranch: Michael, Robert Jr., David, and Thomas, ranging in age from 45 down to 38. All 4 had served in the military, all 4 had returned to help operate the family ranch, and all 4 understood that their livelihood depended on access to hunting revenue during the fall season. What Robert valued most wasn't money, though God knew the ranch generated barely enough to cover expenses in good years and lost money in bad ones. What he valued was the idea that a man's property belonged to him, that boundaries meant something, that you didn't let outsiders tell you how to use land your family had worked for 4 generations. The disputed 43 acres represented more than just hunting territory to Robert Whitmore. It represented everything his grandfather had fought to build, everything his father had died trying to preserve, everything he'd spent his entire adult life defending against banks, government regulations, and wealthy outsiders who wanted to turn Montana into their personal playground. The Anderson family had operated a hunting outfitter business on the disputed land for the past 15 years. James Anderson, 52 years old, ran guided hunts for clients who paid between $8,000 and $15,000 for week-long elk hunting experiences. His operation employed 11 guides during the peak season, men from across Montana who needed seasonal work to supplement their income from ranching, construction, or logging. These weren't wealthy men. They were working-class Montanans who understood the mountains, who could track elk through timber so thick you couldn't see 10 yards, who could field dress a 600-pound bull elk in weather that would hospitalize most people. Men like Jake Morrison, 34, who ran a small construction business in Livingston during summer months, like Tommy Reeves, 41, who worked for the Forest Service fighting wildfires, like Mark Stevens, 28, who guided fishing trips on the Yellowstone River when hunting season ended. They weren't criminals, weren't poachers, weren't the kind of men who looked for trouble. They were Montanans trying to make an honest living in a state where honest livings were increasingly difficult to find. They guided wealthy hunters because the pay was good, because they loved the mountains, and because it was one of the few ways a working man could earn decent money without leaving Montana entirely. What they didn't understand was that Robert Whitmore had decided the Anderson hunting operation represented everything wrong with modern Montana. Wealthy outsiders paying premium prices to hunt land that should belong to local families, guides who worked for Anderson instead of respecting traditional boundary lines. A legal system that seemed more interested in protecting business interests than property rights that stretched back nearly a century. The conflict had been escalating for months before that November morning. In August, Robert had posted no trespassing signs along what he claimed was the proper boundary line. Anderson's guides had removed them, citing their legal right to access the disputed territory under a court order that had been in effect since 2017. In September, Robert had begun driving his ATV along the boundary line every morning, making his presence known, letting the hunting guides understand they were being watched. By October, the tension had reached a breaking point. Anderson's hunting clients were paying premium prices for a wilderness experience, but that experience was being disrupted by an angry rancher who appeared at dawn every morning, glaring at them from across a creek that represented either the legal boundary or an illegal encroachment, depending on which survey you believed. On November 10th, 5 days before the killing began, Robert Whitmore drove his pickup truck to the Anderson base camp and requested a meeting with James Anderson himself. The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes. 3 witnesses heard every word. Robert stood beside his truck, engine still running, looking at Anderson with the flat, cold expression of a man who'd made a decision he wouldn't reconsider. "This is your last warning," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That land belongs to my family. Always has. Your clients and your guides need to stay on your side of the creek. After tomorrow, anyone I find on my property gets treated like a trespasser." Anderson, trying to defuse the situation, explained that they were operating under a valid court order, that the boundary dispute was still being litigated, that both families had legitimate claims that needed to be resolved through legal channels. Robert listened without expression, then shook his head once. Courts don't mean nothing up here. This is Montana. Man's property belongs to him. You got until sunrise November 15th to clear out. After that, we handle this the old way. He climbed back in his truck and drove away, leaving Anderson and his guides standing in the camp, understanding for the first time that they were facing something more dangerous than a property dispute. They were facing a man who'd decided the law had failed and mountain justice was the only option remaining. What Anderson didn't know was that Robert Whitmore had spent the previous month quietly assembling an arsenal and planning an operation that would eliminate the hunting party with military precision. What he didn't know was that Robert's 4 sons had already agreed to support their father, regardless of the consequences. What he didn't know was that sunrise on November 15, 2019, would mark the beginning of the most systematic rural massacre in Montana history. The preparation began on November 11th, 4 days before the deadline Robert had imposed. While Anderson's hunting guides discussed whether to take the threat seriously or continue operating under their court order, Robert Whitmore was methodically preparing for war. He started with reconnaissance, driving the mountain roads at different times of day, noting when the guides moved between camp and hunting areas, when clients left for morning hunts, when they returned in the evening. Robert had learned patience in Vietnam, learned that successful operations required understanding your enemy's patterns, their weaknesses, their predictable behaviors. Anderson's operation followed a rigid schedule. Guides woke clients at 4 in the morning, served breakfast by 4:30, had hunting parties in the field by 5:15. They hunted until 11, returned to camp for lunch and rest, then went out again from 3 until dark. Predictable, methodical, vulnerable. Robert's military training had been artillery, but every soldier learned basic infantry tactics. How to move unseen through terrain, how to establish fields of fire, how to coordinate with other units. Skills he'd tried to forget for 50 years, skills that came flooding back the moment he decided the law wouldn't protect his family's legacy. On November 12th, Robert drove to his brother-in-law's place near Big Timber, 80 miles north of the ranch. Frank Patterson was 71, retired from the railroad, living alone since his wife died of cancer 3 years earlier. Frank had served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home with nightmares and a small arsenal of hunting rifles he'd collected over 5 decades. Frank sat on his porch despite the 20-degree temperature, wrapped in a blanket, oxygen tank beside his chair. Emphysema from 40 years of cigarettes and diesel exhaust had reduced his voice to a raspy whisper, but his mind remained sharp as winter wind. "Bobby," Frank wheezed as Robert climbed the porch steps. "Little early for social calls." "Need to borrow some hardware, Frank?" The old man's eyes narrowed. He'd known Robert since 1973, had watched him build the ranch from nothing, had seen him struggle through bad years and worse years, fighting to keep land that had been in the family since before statehood. This about that hunting outfit. "Anderson's people crossed the line. I warned them. They chose to ignore it." Frank was quiet for a long time, breathing through the plastic tubes that kept him alive. The temperature was dropping as clouds moved in from the west, promising snow before morning. "How many you need?" "Enough for 5 men." Frank struggled to his feet, shuffled inside. The house smelled like old coffee and heating oil, silent except for the hiss of the oxygen concentrator. He returned 15 minutes later carrying 2 rifle cases. "Remington 700 and 306, Frank said, setting down the first case. "Browning A-bolt and 300 Winchester Magnum, both sighted in at 200 yards. You remember how to shoot?" "I remember." Frank handed over 4 boxes of ammunition, premium hunting loads designed to drop an elk at 300 yards. "Bobby, you do this. There's no coming back. Understand that?" "I understand." "Your boys will go to prison. You'll die in prison. Sarah will be alone." Robert took the rifles, feeling their weight, remembering the last time he'd held a weapon with the intention of ending human life. That had been in a jungle on the other side of the world, when the enemy wore uniforms and the rules of engagement were clear. Anderson should have respected the boundary. Frank let go of the rifle cases, shaking his head. "Should have, could have, would have. Don't mean nothing once the shooting starts." Over the next 2 days, Robert quietly assembled additional weapons from his own collection and his son's. Michael owned a Winchester Model 70 in 30-06, the same rifle he'd used to take his first elk at age 12. Robert Jr. had a Savage 110 in 7mm Remington Magnum, bought with his first paycheck after returning from Afghanistan. David carried a Ruger 77 in 308 Winchester, inherited from his grandfather. Thomas preferred his Weatherby Vanguard in 270 Winchester, accurate enough to drop a deer at 400 yards. These weren't assault weapons or military hardware. They were hunting rifles, the kind every ranch family owned, designed for taking game animals at long range in open country. But in the hands of men who'd learned to shoot before they could drive, who'd spent decades hunting in conditions that would challenge Navy SEALs, they were precision instruments capable of ending life with mechanical efficiency. Robert didn't purchase anything new, didn't create a paper trail that could be traced. Everything came from family collections accumulated over generations, weapons passed down from fathers to sons, along with the knowledge of how to use them effectively. But he did buy ammunition, 5 boxes of premium hunting loads from different stores across 3 counties. One in Livingston, one in Bozeman, one in Big Timber, one in Columbus, one in Red Lodge. He paid cash, kept receipts in a coffee can under his kitchen sink, some part of him still believing in documentation, in proving he'd followed legal procedures right up until the moment legality failed. On November 13th, Robert spread topographic maps across his kitchen table, maps from the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, showing every ridge, creek, and game trail in the disputed territory. He'd been walking this country since he was old enough to follow his father on horseback, knew it in all seasons, all weather conditions, but planning required precision. He marked the Anderson base camp with a red circle, marked their hunting areas with yellow highlighter, marked escape routes and approach routes with blue ink. His sons stood around the table studying the terrain, understanding what their father intended without anyone speaking the words aloud. "They'll split into 3 groups," Robert said, tracing his finger along the map. "Morning hunt starts here, moves up Elk Creek toward the saddle. Afternoon hunt covers this drainage, works back toward Bear Canyon. Base camp stays here with guides who aren't hunting." Michael, the eldest at 45, studied the topography with the eye of a man who'd spent 2 tours in Iraq, learning how terrain shaped tactical operations. "Dad, this is military planning, like Iraq. Iraq taught you how to stay alive when people were trying to kill you," Robert replied. "This country taught me the same thing, just different enemy, different rules." He tapped the map where Elk Creek narrowed between granite cliffs. "Choke points here and here, natural funnels. They'll have to pass through if they're hunting their usual pattern." Robert Jr. pointed to the base camp location. "What about the guides who stay behind?" "Every man who works for Anderson is part of the problem. They know this is disputed land. They know they're trespassing. They chose their side." David, 39 years old, looked at his father with an expression caught between loyalty and horror. "Dad, we're talking about killing people. Not elk, not deer. People with families." Robert met his son's eyes, seeing his own doubts reflected there, seeing the moment when good men realize they're about to become something else entirely. Anderson's guides chose to work for him knowing this land was disputed. Anderson chose to ignore my warning. They had their chance to do right. Now they face the consequences. Thomas, the youngest at 38, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, understood violence in ways his older brothers didn't. "How many we looking at?" 11 guides total. Could be fewer if some stayed home. Could be more if Anderson brought in extra help for the season. Robert traced the hunting routes again, calculating distances, timing, coordination required. "We do this right. Nobody gets away to call for help. We do this wrong. We all go to prison for the rest of our lives." The room fell silent except for wind rattling windows and the distant lowing of cattle in the barn. Outside, snow had begun falling, fat flakes that would cover tracks, muffle sound, provide concealment for what was coming. "I won't order any of you to do this," Robert said finally. "This is my choice, my responsibility. Walk away now if you want. I'll understand." Michael looked at his younger brothers, then back at his father. "We're family, Dad. Whitmore land belongs to Whitmores. We stand together." One by one, the other sons nodded. David reluctantly, Thomas with grim determination, Robert Jr. with the fatalistic acceptance of a soldier who'd seen what happened when good men did nothing while their families were destroyed. What they were planning wasn't justice in any legal sense. It was something older, more primitive, the kind of frontier law that had governed Montana Territory before courts and lawyers and property surveys complicated the simple truth that a man's land belonged to him, and anyone who disputed that faced consequences measured in blood rather than legal briefs. At 10:30 that night, each son drove home to his own family, his own house, his own life that would be forever changed in 36 hours. They kissed wives goodbye, tucked children into bed, sat in darkened living rooms staring at hunting rifles and wondering if they had the courage to use them on human beings instead of elk. Robert sat alone in his kitchen, maps spread before him, studying approach routes by lamplight. Sarah had gone to bed hours earlier, understanding without being told that her husband was planning something terrible, something necessary, something that would destroy their family even if it saved their land. Outside, snow continued falling. By morning, there would be 6 inches on the ground, enough to slow movement, enough to make tracking easier, enough to muffle the sound of rifles firing in the gray dawn light of November 15th, 2019. November 15th, 2019. Robert woke at 3:30 in the morning on November 15th, 2 hours before his usual time. The house was silent except for the hiss of wind through pine trees and the steady tick of the grandfather clock his father had bought in 1962. He lay in bed for 10 minutes, listening to Sarah's breathing beside him, memorizing the sound because he knew this might be the last morning he'd ever wake up as a free man. The coffee was already brewing when he reached the kitchen. His hands moved automatically through the routine he'd followed for 45 years, but everything felt different now, charged with the knowledge that by sunset he'd either be dead or transformed into something his grandfather never intended when he'd homesteaded this land in 1923. Outside, 6 inches of fresh snow covered the ranch, turning the familiar landscape into something from a Christmas card. Beautiful and deadly, like everything in Montana, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero. Perfect hunting weather if you were hunting elk. Perfect killing weather if you were hunting men. At 4:15, Michael's headlights swept across the kitchen window as his truck turned into the driveway. Robert Jr. arrived 5 minutes later, then David, then Thomas. They gathered in the kitchen without speaking, 4 grown men who'd learned to handle weapons before they could properly tie their shoes, now preparing to use those weapons on human beings for the first time in their lives. Robert poured coffee into 5 thermos bottles, black and strong enough to keep a man alert through whatever came next. He handed each son a thermos, along with a box of ammunition and a topographic map marked with positions, routes, and timing. "Everyone clear on the plan?" Robert's voice was steady, showing none of the doubt that had kept him awake most of the night. Michael nodded first. "I take the high ground above Elk Creek, cover the main approach route from camp to hunting area. Robert Jr., Bear Canyon drainage, cut off retreat back toward the parking area. David, base camp perimeter, handle anyone who stays behind. Thomas, mobile reserve, respond wherever needed." Robert studied his youngest son's face, seeing something he recognized from his own time in Vietnam, the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd already mentally crossed the line between civilization and warfare. "You all right with this, Tommy?" Thomas met his father's eyes. "Afghanistan taught me that sometimes good men have to do terrible things to protect what matters. This matters, Dad." At 4:45, they loaded rifles into the backs of their trucks and drove into the darkness toward the disputed territory. No convoy, no formation, just 5 separate vehicles taking different routes to predetermined positions. If anyone stopped them, they were heading out for morning elk hunting, same as hundreds of other Montanans on any November day. Robert took the longest route, swinging wide through national forest roads that would bring him to the ridge overlooking Anderson's base camp from the east. The roads were treacherous with fresh snow, but his truck had 4-wheel drive and chains, and he'd driven these mountains in conditions that would strand most vehicles. As he drove, Robert thought about his grandfather, Samuel Whitmore, who'd claimed this land under the Homestead Act when Montana was still more territory than state. Samuel had built the original cabin with his own hands, cleared fields with a team of draft horses, survived winters that killed cattle and sometimes people. He'd fought off claim jumpers with a Winchester lever-action rifle, settled disputes with fists and firearms because there was no law except what a man could enforce himself. Samuel had never imagined a future where his great-grandson would need lawyers and court orders to protect family land. Never imagined a world where wealthy outsiders could use legal technicalities to steal what 4 generations had built through sweat and sacrifice and blood. At 5:20, Robert reached his position on the ridge. Through his rifle scope, he could see Anderson's base camp 300 yards below, smoke rising from the cook tent, guides moving between cabins, preparing for the morning hunt, clients emerging from heated tents, breath steaming in the frigid air, excited about their expensive Montana hunting experience. 11 men total. Robert counted them twice, memorized faces, noted who carried rifles and who carried only binoculars and cameras. These weren't soldiers, weren't criminals, weren't even particularly bad men. They were working Montanans and wealthy tourists who'd made the mistake of trusting a legal system that Robert believed had failed completely. At 5:35, his radio crackled. Michael's voice, calm and professional. Position 1 ready. Position 2 ready, from Robert Jr. Position 3 ready, from David. Position 4 ready, from Thomas. Robert keyed his radio once. The signal they'd agreed on. No words, no discussion, just acknowledgement that the Whitmore family was in position to eliminate 11 men who'd chosen to ignore mountain justice. Below, Anderson's hunting party began moving out from camp. 3 groups, exactly as Robert had predicted. The first group of 4 men headed up Elk Creek toward the high country where elk were feeding at dawn. The second group of 3 moved toward Bear Canyon, planning to hunt the timber where deer were bedding during daylight hours. The third group of 4 remained in camp, guides who would clean equipment, prepare lunch, and monitor radio communications. Anderson himself stayed with the base camp group. Robert could see him through the scope, 52 years old, wearing expensive hunting gear, completely unaware that a man with a rifle was watching him from 300 yards away. Completely unaware that he had less than 30 minutes to live. At 5:47, the first hunting party reached the narrow section of Elk Creek, where Michael waited in concealment. Through his radio, Robert heard his oldest son's breathing change, becoming slower, more controlled. The breathing of a man preparing to cross a line he could never uncross. The elk hunters moved single file along the creek bank, following a game trail that generations of animals had carved into the hillside. They were talking quietly, discussing where they might find elk, whether the fresh snow would make tracking easier or harder. Normal conversation of men who had no idea they were walking into an ambush. Jake Morrison led the group, 34 years old, construction worker from Livingston, trying to earn enough money guiding hunters to pay for his daughter's medical bills. He carried a Remington 730-06, scope covers off, ready for elk that might appear in the gray dawn light. Behind him walked Tommy Reeves, 41, Forest Service firefighter, supporting a wife and 3 kids on seasonal wages that barely covered rent and groceries. Mark Stevens, 28, guided fishing trips in summer, hunting trips in fall, scraped by through Montana's brutal winters doing odd jobs and hoping for work. The fourth man was a client, Dr. Richard Hartwell from Denver, 63 years old, orthopedic surgeon who'd paid $12,000 for a week-long elk hunting experience. He'd hunted Montana for 15 years, considered himself almost a local, donated money to wildlife conservation, believed he was participating in legitimate outdoor recreation. They were 40 yards from Michael's position when Robert's radio crackled, his son's voice, tight with stress but still controlled. Contact, 4 targets, engaging. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, rolling off granite cliffs and pine-covered ridges. Jake Morrison dropped instantly, the bullet catching him center mass, his rifle clattering onto frozen ground as his body crumpled beside the creek. Tommy Reeves spun toward the sound, trying to locate the shooter, raising his own rifle. Michael's second shot took him in the chest before he could aim. Tommy fell backward into the creek, blood mixing with ice-cold water, his body wedging against a fallen log. Dr. Hartwell ran, pure instinct overriding rational thought, crashing through timber toward the hunting camp. Mark Stevens dropped flat behind a boulder, trying to return fire at muzzle flashes he could barely see through falling snow and early morning shadows. Michael's third shot found Mark Stevens as he raised his head above cover. The young guide's body went limp, rifle sliding down the rock face into the creek where it would be found 3 days later by search teams looking for survivors. Dr. Hartwell made it almost 200 yards before David's rifle spoke from the base camp perimeter. The surgeon fell face first into snow that quickly turned red, his expensive hunting gear useless against precision marksmanship from men who'd learned to shoot before they could properly read. 4 men eliminated in less than 60 seconds. The first phase of Robert Whitmore's operation was complete, executed with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers who'd trained for this moment without realizing it every hunting season for the past 30 years. At the base camp, Anderson and his remaining guides heard the gunshots echoing across the valley. Their first thought was that one of the hunting parties had found elk. Successful hunters often fired multiple shots to bring down wounded animals, and echo effects in mountain terrain made it difficult to determine exact locations or number of shots. But when radio calls to the Elk Creek hunting party went unanswered, understanding began to dawn. James Anderson grabbed his rifle and started toward the sound of gunfire, following the same creek trail his guides had taken 30 minutes earlier. He made it 50 yards before Robert's bullet found him. Anderson fell beside the same creek where his grandfather had trapped beaver in 1943, where his father had taught him to fish for trout in 1967, where he'd planned to bring his own grandchildren someday to continue family traditions that would end with his death on November 15, 2019. The remaining camp guides scattered, some running toward vehicles in the parking area, others grabbing rifles and trying to establish defensive positions around the cook tent and equipment trailers. They were brave men, experienced outdoorsmen who understood mountain dangers, but they weren't soldiers. They'd never trained for coordinated assault by multiple shooters with military precision. Robert Jr. eliminated 2 guides who tried to reach the vehicles, his shots echoing across Bear Canyon where the second hunting party was beginning to understand they were under attack rather than listening to successful elk hunters. David moved through the base camp systematically, clearing tents and trailers with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd learned urban warfare in Fallujah and applied those lessons to mountain terrain. By 6:15, 7 men were dead. The Anderson hunting operation had been reduced to 4 guides scattered across 2 square miles of forest, armed but disorganized, trying to survive until help arrived from a world that had no idea anything was wrong. The second hunting party, 3 men working the Bear Canyon drainage, heard the sustained gunfire and attempted to retreat toward their vehicles. They moved as a unit, covering each other, using terrain for concealment, displaying the kind of teamwork that might have saved them under different circumstances. But they were moving through country that Robert Jr. had hunted since childhood, following game trails he could navigate blindfolded toward a parking area he'd covered with interlocking fields of fire. When they emerged from heavy timber at 6:28, he was waiting. The first guide, Marcus Webb, 43 years old, diesel mechanic from Billings, died instantly. The second, Carl Hendricks, 35, ranch hand from Columbus, made it 10 steps before Robert Jr.'s second shot dropped him beside a deadfall pine that had stood for 40 years and would stand for 40 years, 40 more, indifferent to human tragedy. The third man, another client named William Chase from Chicago, a successful businessman who'd hunted Africa and Alaska, who considered himself experienced with dangerous game, hid behind a granite boulder and tried to call for help on his satellite phone. The call connected to emergency dispatch in Livingston at 6:31. "This is William Chase. I'm being shot at in the mountains south of Livingston. Multiple shooters. People are dead. Send help immediately." The call lasted 18 seconds before Thomas Whitmore's bullet ended it. Chase's phone fell into snow beside his body, the emergency dispatcher hearing only wind and silence from coordinates that would guide rescue teams to the killing field 3 hours later. By 6:45, 10 men were dead. 1 guide remained alive, hidden in heavy timber near the original base camp, wounded but conscious, listening to boot falls crunching through snow as the Whitmore family conducted their final sweep of the killing zone. The surviving guide was Danny Martinez, 26 years old, newest member of Anderson's team, hired just 2 months earlier when his construction job in Bozeman had ended with the first snow. He lay pressed against the base of a massive ponderosa pine, blood seeping from a graze across his left shoulder, trying to control his breathing, while boots moved through the snow somewhere behind him. Danny had served 1 tour in Afghanistan before coming home to Montana, thinking he'd left warfare behind forever. Now he was reliving the worst moments of his deployment, listening to methodical footsteps of men who hunted humans with the same patience they used for elk. His radio was dead, shattered by tree branches during his desperate flight from the base camp. His rifle lay somewhere in the snow where he'd dropped it while running for his life. Through the timber he could hear voices, calm, professional, discussing the operation like ranchers talking about moving cattle. No excitement, no emotion, just men completing a job they'd planned carefully. "Sweep complete on the north side," Michael's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "No movement." "South perimeter clear," from David. "Found blood trail heading toward the big pine grove." "I'll take the grove," Robert's voice, older, carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded this operation from the beginning. "Rest of you spread out. Make sure nobody gets past us." Danny closed his eyes, tried to think. The parking area was 400 yards east, but they'd have it covered. The Forest Service road was 6 miles north, too far to reach before they found him. The nearest ranch was 8 miles south through country so rough it would take hours to cross, if he could cross it at all with a wounded shoulder and no winter gear. His only chance was to remain hidden until search and rescue teams arrived. Someone would have heard the gunfire, someone would investigate the missed radio checks, someone would come looking. He just had to survive until then. At 7:15, Robert Whitmore reached the grove of old-growth pines, where Danny lay concealed. Robert moved like a man who'd spent 70 years learning to walk silently through forest, placing each foot carefully, avoiding branches that might crack, snow that might crunch, any sound that might alert prey to his presence. Danny held his breath as footsteps passed within 10 feet of his position. Through a gap in the pine boughs, he could see Robert's legs, the worn leather boots, the faded jeans, the rifle carried with casual competence of a man who'd been hunting dangerous game his entire life. Robert stopped, stood perfectly still for 30 seconds, listening. The forest had gone silent except for wind moving through branches high overhead. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no normal sounds of life. Just the oppressive quiet that follows violence, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. "Danny Martinez," Robert called out, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "I know you're in here somewhere, son. Saw your blood trail leading this way." Danny's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was certain Robert could hear it. 20 feet away, Death stood in worn ranch clothes, speaking to him like a neighbor asking about borrowed tools. "You're wounded, it's below zero, and you're 8 miles from help," Robert continued. "You can come out now and we'll make this quick, or you can freeze to death over the next few hours. Your choice." Silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Danny could feel his shoulder stiffening, blood loss making him dizzy, cold seeping through his clothing despite the adrenaline keeping him alert. Robert was right about the cold. Montana winter killed people every year, hunters who got lost or injured and couldn't reach shelter before hypothermia claimed them. "I know you were just doing a job," Robert said, moving closer to Danny's hiding spot. "Nothing personal against you. But you chose to work for Anderson, chose to guide hunters on land that belongs to my family. That makes you part of the problem." Robert's radio crackled. Michael's voice. "Dad, we need to move. It's been over an hour. Someone's going to come looking." "5 more minutes," Robert replied. "Got one left to finish." Danny heard footsteps moving away, then circling back from a different direction. Robert was hunting him systematically, using the same techniques that worked on wounded elk. Patience, persistence, understanding that injured animals made predictable mistakes when pressed. At 7:23, Danny made his mistake. A branch heavy with snow chose that moment to dump its load with a soft thump 20 yards from his position. Danny's head turned toward the sound instinctively, movement that caught Robert's peripheral vision. The old rancher's rifle swung toward Danny's position with mechanical precision. Through the scope, Robert could see the young guide's face, pale with cold and fear, eyes wide with the understanding that his hiding place had been discovered. For a moment, neither man moved. Hunter and hunted, separated by 20 feet of Montana wilderness and a choice that would define the rest of Robert Whitmore's life. "Please," Danny whispered, the word barely audible in the mountain silence. "I got a girlfriend back in Bozeman. We're supposed to get married next spring." Robert's finger rested on the trigger, steady despite the cold. His breathing remained controlled, professional, the breathing of a man who'd made this choice 10 times already this morning. "Should have thought about that before you came onto my land." The shot echoed across the valley one final time. Danny Martinez fell backward into snow that would cover his body within hours. Hiding the evidence until spring melt revealed what remained of Anderson's hunting operation. 11 men eliminated in less than 2 hours. The systematic rural massacre Robert Whitmore had planned was complete, executed with the precision of a military operation and the ruthlessness of men who believed they were defending everything that mattered. At 7:30, the 4 Whitmore men regrouped at Robert's truck, hidden in timber half a mile from the killing zone. They moved efficiently, loading rifles, checking equipment, preparing to leave the mountains before law enforcement arrived. None of them spoke about what they'd done. There would be time for processing later. Time for understanding the weight of 11 lives ended, time for reckoning with the choice they'd made. For now, there was only the immediate necessity of escape. Robert keyed his radio one final time. Clean sweep complete, moving to secondary positions. They drove away in different directions, taking separate routes back to the ranch, where Sarah Whitmore was preparing breakfast. She knew her husband and sons might never eat as free men. The snow continued falling, covering tire tracks, muffling sound, erasing evidence of the morning's work. Behind them, 11 bodies lay scattered across 14 square miles of pristine Montana wilderness. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, men who'd kissed wives goodbye that morning expecting to return home with stories of successful hunts and clear mountain air. Instead, they'd become casualties in a war they didn't know they were fighting. Victims of a boundary dispute that had festered for generations until it exploded into violence that would forever change a small Montana community. The mountains kept their silence, indifferent to human tragedy, continuing their ancient rhythms, while snow covered the blood and the wind carried away the echoes of gunfire that had marked the end of the Anderson hunting operation and the beginning of the most extensive manhunt in Park County history. At 8:45, when the first missed radio check triggered concern at Anderson's main office in Livingston, the Whitmore family was already home, rifles cleaned and stored, alibis prepared, waiting for the inevitable knock on their door that would come with dawn of a new day. But the blood had been shed. The boundary had been defended. And for the first time in nearly a century, the disputed 43 acres belonged unquestionably to the Whitmore family, purchased with a price that no court would ever consider legal tender. The discovery began at 9:17 that morning when Anderson's business partner, Marcus Thompson, arrived at the hunting lodge's main office in Livingston, expecting to coordinate supply runs for the camps. Anderson was supposed to call in every 2 hours during active hunts, a safety protocol they'd maintained religiously for 15 years of guiding operations. The missed 8 o'clock check hadn't concerned Thompson initially. Radio dead zones existed throughout the mountains. Equipment malfunctioned in extreme cold. Hunters sometimes got so focused on tracking animals they forgot scheduled communications. But when 9 o'clock passed without contact, then 9:15, Thompson felt the first stirrings of genuine worry. He tried Anderson's satellite phone first, then the base camp radio, then individual guide frequencies. Nothing but static and the electronic hiss of empty channels. Thompson had guided hunters himself for 2 decades before moving into the business side of operations. He understood mountain dangers, equipment failures, the dozen ways experienced outdoorsmen could find themselves in trouble despite careful planning. At 9:30, Thompson called Park County Sheriff's Dispatch and requested a welfare check on the hunting party. Deputy Sarah Mitchell took the call, noted the location coordinates, and dispatched the closest patrol unit to investigate. Standard procedure for overdue hunting parties, usually resulting in embarrassed hunters who'd lost track of time or suffered minor equipment problems. Deputy Rick Valdez was 28 years old, 6 months out of the Montana Law Enforcement Academy, still young enough to believe that police work in rural Montana meant helping stranded motorists and investigating minor property crimes. He'd grown up in Billings, requested assignment to Park County because he wanted to work in country where you could see mountains from your office window. Valdez reached the Anderson parking area at 10:15, finding 3 vehicles covered with fresh snow but showing no signs of disturbance. He keyed his radio and reported normal conditions, then began hiking toward the base camp location Thompson had provided. The snow was 8 inches deep and still falling, making the trek slow and exhausting for someone not accustomed to winter mountain travel. At 10:42, Valdez reached the ridge overlooking Anderson's base camp and immediately understood he was dealing with something beyond his training and experience. Through his binoculars, he could see bodies scattered around the camp area, dark shapes against white snow that could only be human remains. His radio call to dispatch reflected the shock of a young officer encountering his first mass casualty scene. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I need immediate backup at the Anderson hunting camp. Multiple casualties. Appears to be gunshot wounds. Request FBI notification and crime scene team response. By 11:30, Park County Sheriff Jim Crawford was coordinating the largest law enforcement response in the county's history. Crawford was 54 years old, 32 years wearing the badge, had dealt with hunting accidents, domestic violence, occasional drug-related shootings, but nothing approaching the scale of what his deputy described from the mountain crime scene. FBI Special Agent Catherine Ross arrived from the Billings office at 1:15 that afternoon, called in from a bank robbery investigation the moment the body count exceeded federal thresholds. Ross was 41, 15 years with the Bureau, had worked everything from white-collar fraud to domestic terrorism. She'd investigated the 2017 Las Vegas shooting, had seen what coordinated violence looked like when planned by methodical killers. Standing in the Anderson base camp, surrounded by crime scene tape and evidence markers, Ross immediately recognized patterns that distinguished this from random violence or hunting accidents gone wrong. The positioning of bodies, the precision of wounds, the systematic nature of the eliminations all pointed to coordinated assault by multiple shooters with military training. "Sheriff," Ross said, crouching beside Anderson's body near the creek, "I count 11 victims across approximately 2 square miles. Single gunshot wounds, all fatal, all from high-powered rifles. This wasn't random. This was planned." Crawford nodded grimly, watching crime scene technicians photograph evidence in the fading afternoon light. "Any ideas on motive?" "Property dispute seems most likely. Thompson mentioned Anderson's been fighting with a local rancher over boundary lines. Emotions run high when people think their land's being stolen." Ross walked the perimeter of the killing zone, studying sight lines, calculating fields of fire, reconstructing the tactical elements of the operation. Whoever planned this had understood the terrain, anticipated victim movement patterns, positioned shooters to create overlapping kill zones with no escape routes. "How many shooters we looking at?" Ross studied shell casings being collected by evidence teams, noting different calibers and firing positions. "Minimum 4, probably 5. Different rifles, coordinated timing, military-style assault. Whoever did this had training." While Ross processed the crime scene, rumors spread through Park County like wildfire in drought conditions. Anderson's hunting operation eliminated, 11 men dead, no survivors. The details varied with each telling, but the essential facts remained constant. Someone had declared war on the hunting guides and won decisively. At Betty's Cafe in Livingston, the Sunday afternoon crowd discussed little else. Ranchers, merchants, retired miners, all trying to understand how neighbor could turn against neighbor with such devastating violence. Most knew about the Anderson-Whitmore boundary dispute, knew tensions had been escalating, but few had imagined it could explode into wholesale slaughter. "I heard it was drug dealers," offered Earl Hopkins, who owned the local feed store. "Anderson might have been running drugs through his hunting operation, got sideways with his suppliers." Martha Weber, retired school teacher, shook her head. "James Anderson was a good man, honest businessman. This was about land, not drugs. Someone decided to settle an old dispute with rifles instead of lawyers." At the Whitmore Ranch, 12 miles from where FBI agents processed evidence and collected bodies, Sarah Whitmore prepared Sunday dinner with hands that trembled slightly despite her effort to maintain normal routines. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, biscuits from scratch, apple pie cooling on the kitchen counter. The same meal she'd cooked every Sunday for 46 years of marriage. Robert sat in his chair by the window, reading the same page of his Bible for the 3rd time, unable to concentrate on scripture while images of the morning's work played behind his eyes. His sons had scattered to their own homes, their own families, their own attempts to process what they'd become in the space of 2 hours. Outside, snow continued falling, now 12 inches deep and accumulating faster than snowplows could clear rural roads. Weather that would complicate the investigation, delay evidence collection, give the Whitmore family precious time to prepare for what was coming. Because something was coming. Robert had lived in Montana long enough to understand how these situations developed. Evidence would be analyzed, witnesses interviewed, suspects identified. Federal agents would arrive with search warrants and arrest warrants and the full weight of a justice system that wouldn't understand mountain law or family honor or the difference between murder and protecting what belonged to you. At 4:30 that afternoon, while crime scene teams worked to recover bodies before darkness fell, Agent Ross received preliminary ballistics information from the mobile lab unit. 5 different rifles, all hunting calibers common in Montana: Remington, Winchester, Browning, Savage, Weatherby. The kind of weapons every ranch family owned, passed down through generations, used for legitimate hunting and livestock protection. No assault rifles, no military hardware, the technician reported. Just hunting rifles, but used by people who knew how to shoot. Every wound was fatal. Most were single shots. These weren't spray-and-pray shooters. Ross studied topographic maps, identifying the high ground position shooters would have needed to achieve the angles documented by crime scene analysis. Natural sniper positions overlooking the base camp, creek drainage, and vehicle access routes. Perfect ambush terrain for anyone familiar with the country. "Sheriff, I need a list of local residents with military backgrounds and known conflicts with the Anderson operation." Crawford already had the list prepared. 23 names, mostly veterans, mostly ranchers, mostly men who'd expressed opposition to Anderson's hunting business over the years. But one name stood out above the others: Robert James Whitmore, Vietnam veteran, engaged in active litigation over boundary disputes, known to have threatened Anderson just 5 days earlier. Whitmore, Ross read from the file, 68 years old, owns ranch adjacent to disputed territory. 4 sons, all military veterans, all involved in family operation. Multiple witnesses heard him threaten Anderson on November 10th. "Bobby Whitmore's been fighting over that boundary since his daddy died in '93, Crawford said. "Court battles, survey disputes, lots of bad blood, but I never figured him for mass murder." Ross closed the file, looked out at the darkening mountains where 11 families had lost fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, where evidence was accumulating that would point federal investigators toward a ranch family that had chosen frontier justice over legal remedies. Time to pay the Whitmores a visit. The convoy left Livingston at 5:15 that evening. 3 FBI vehicles, 2 sheriff's units, Montana State Police backup, all equipped with snow chains and emergency gear for mountain travel in deteriorating weather. Not enough agents for a full assault, but sufficient to conduct interviews and assess whether the Whitmore family represented immediate flight risk. Agent Ross rode with Sheriff Crawford, studying case files and property surveys, while their vehicle navigated increasingly treacherous roads. Snow was falling harder now, visibility dropping to less than 50 yards, wind gusting strong enough to rock the heavy patrol vehicle. "What's your read on Robert Whitmore?" Ross asked. Crawford considered the question while negotiating a hairpin turn that dropped away into darkness on the passenger side. "Old-school Montana rancher, tough, stubborn, believes in settling his own problems. Lost his father young, built the ranch from nothing, fought off bankruptcy 3 times. Not a man who backs down easy. Military service? Vietnam, artillery, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, honorable discharge. Came home and never talked about it, far as I know. His boys all served too. Iraq, Afghanistan. Good family, respected in the community, but pushed too far." The Whitmore ranch buildings appeared through the snow at 6:47, yellow lights in the windows creating an illusion of warmth and safety. Normal ranch on a Sunday evening, family gathered for dinner, unaware that federal agents were about to transform their lives forever. Crawford parked 50 yards from the house, close enough for easy approach, but distant enough to provide tactical options if the situation deteriorated. Ross counted vehicles in the driveway, 5 pickup trucks, all with snow accumulation suggesting they'd been parked for hours. Either the Whitmore family had spent a quiet Sunday at home, or they'd returned from morning activities and remained in place since. "No movement," Ross observed through binoculars. "Lights on in the main house, smoke from the chimney. Looks normal." Crawford keyed his radio, confirming backup units were in position on access roads leading away from the ranch. If anyone tried to run, they'd be intercepted before reaching main highways. If anyone decided to fight, additional officers were minutes away despite the deteriorating weather. At 6:55, Ross and Crawford approached the front door while other agents positioned themselves around the house perimeter. Standard procedure for high-risk interviews, especially when dealing with military veterans who might possess significant weapons collections and tactical knowledge. Robert Whitmore answered the door before they knocked, as if he'd been watching their approach through darkened windows. He stood in the doorway wearing clean ranch clothes, hands visible, expression calm despite the obvious law enforcement presence surrounding his home. "Sheriff Crawford," Robert said, nodding recognition. Agent Ross, I'm guessing. Been expecting you folks. The admission surprised Ross, though she kept her reaction controlled. Most suspects expressed shock or confusion when contacted by federal investigators. Robert Whitmore seemed almost relieved that the waiting was over. Mr. Whitmore, we'd like to ask you some questions about the incident at Anderson's hunting camp this morning. Figured you would. Come on in out of the snow. Sarah's got coffee on. Robert led them into a kitchen that smelled like pot roast and coffee, where Sarah Whitmore sat at a wooden table that had probably served the family for decades. She looked up at the agents with eyes that held resignation rather than surprise, as if she'd been preparing for this moment longer than just one day. "Coffee?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Thank you, ma'am," Crawford accepted, understanding that refusing hospitality in rural Montana could be interpreted as hostility. Ross studied the kitchen while Sarah poured coffee into ceramic mugs, family photographs on the walls, children and grandchildren, military service photos, ranch scenes spanning generations. Normal family home, except for the tension that filled the air like smoke from a distant fire. "Mr. Whitmore," Ross began carefully, "we understand you had a dispute with James Anderson over property boundaries." "That's right. Been fighting over the same 43 acres since my daddy died. Court's been working on it for 26 years now. You spoke with Anderson on November 10th. 3 witnesses heard you threaten him." Robert sipped his coffee, studying Ross with eyes that held depths she couldn't read. "I warned him. Told him to keep his guides off my land after November 15th. Told him we'd handle it mountain style if he didn't." The admission sent electricity through the room. Crawford shifted in his chair, hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. Ross maintained eye contact with Robert, recognizing the moment when suspects either cooperated completely or stopped talking entirely. "What did you mean by mountain style, Mr. Whitmore?" "Meant exactly what I said. Up here, man's property belongs to him. You cross the line, you face the consequences." "Where were you this morning between 5 and 8 a.m.? Robert set down his coffee mug with deliberate care. "Right here, getting ready for church, having breakfast with my wife. We go to services at Riverside Baptist every Sunday." Sarah Whitmore nodded confirmation, but Ross noticed something in her expression that suggested the alibi wasn't entirely accurate. The kind of subtle tells that came from years of interrogating suspects who mixed truth with carefully constructed lies. "Your sons, where were they this morning?" "You'd have to ask them. They're grown men with their own lives." Ross made notes while studying family dynamics. Robert remained calm, answering questions with the measured responses of someone who'd prepared for this conversation. Sarah showed signs of stress but supported her husband's statements. Both seemed resigned to whatever consequences were coming. "Mr. Whitmore, 11 people are dead. This is the largest mass killing in Montana history. If you know something about what happened, now would be the time to tell us." Robert looked at his wife, then back at Ross. "Agent, I've lived in these mountains for 68 years. Seen a lot of changes, most of them bad. Outsiders coming in, buying up land, telling locals how to live. Courts that favor money over what's right." He paused, gathering his thoughts like a man preparing to deliver a sermon. "James Anderson was a good man in some ways, but he chose to ignore boundaries that my family's respected for 4 generations. Chose to trust lawyers instead of neighbors. Chose to treat my land like it belonged to him." "That's not a confession, Mr. Whitmore. No, it's an explanation. Sometimes good men get pushed to places they never wanted to go." Ross sensed the interview approaching a critical juncture. Robert Whitmore was dancing around admissions without making direct statements, providing insight into motive while avoiding specific confessions that could be used in court. "We'll need to search your property, look at your weapons, check for evidence." "I figured you would." Robert reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a folded document. "Got the warrant right here. Been waiting for you to serve it." Crawford examined the papers with confusion. "Mr. Whitmore, this isn't a warrant. This is a property survey from 1923. Shows the original boundary markers my grandfather surveyed when he homesteaded this place. Shows that 43 acres belongs to the Whitmore family. Always has, always will." Robert stood up slowly, hands visible, movements deliberate. "You'll find my rifles in the gun safe. Combination is my birth date. ammunition's in the barn, everything legal, everything accounted for. Ross recognized the careful phrasing of a man who understood legal implications while avoiding direct admissions. Robert Whitmore was providing access without confessing, cooperating without incriminating himself or his family. "We'll need to speak with your sons as well. They'll be here directly. Called them when I saw your lights coming up the drive." As if summoned by his words, headlights swept across the kitchen windows as vehicles arrived in the driveway. 4 pickup trucks, 4 Whitmore sons returning to the family ranch to face whatever consequences awaited them. Ross watched through the window as the men emerged from their vehicles, moving with military precision despite the informal family gathering. They walked toward the house in formation, oldest to youngest, presenting a united front that suggested careful preparation. "Mr. Whitmore," Ross said quietly, "before your sons arrive, is there anything you want to tell me? Anything that might help us understand what happened this morning?" Robert looked at his wife one final time, then met Ross's eyes with an expression that held both defiance and resignation. "Agent Ross, some things matter more than law. Family, honor, protecting what belongs to you. When the system fails, when courts can't help, when lawyers profit while good people suffer, a man does what he has to do." The front door opened as his sons entered the kitchen, 4 military veterans who'd chosen to stand with their father regardless of consequences. They took seats around the table without speaking, presenting themselves for whatever questioning would follow. Ross understood she was witnessing something rare in federal investigations, a family united by code stronger than law, prepared to face prosecution together rather than abandon principles that predated statehood. The interview was just beginning, but the outcome was already clear. The Whitmore family had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, chosen frontier justice over legal remedies, decided that honor mattered more than freedom. 11 men were dead, their families destroyed, their futures erased by a boundary dispute that had festered for generations before exploding into violence that would mark Park County forever. The interrogation stretched through the night as FBI agents processed what would become the most methodical family confession in federal law enforcement history. One by one, the Whitmore sons provided detailed accounts of their roles in the morning's operation, speaking with the matter-of-fact precision of soldiers debriefing after a successful mission. Michael described his position above Elk Creek, the 4 hunters who'd walked into his field of fire, the mechanical sequence of shots that had eliminated them before they could comprehend what was happening. His voice remained steady, clinical, as if he were describing a particularly successful deer hunt rather than the systematic execution of human beings. Robert Jr. explained his coverage of Bear Canyon, how he'd anticipated the retreat routes, positioned himself to cut off escape attempts. David detailed his sweep of the base camp, the methodical clearing of tents and trailers, the professional efficiency that had left no survivors among the guides who'd chosen to stand and fight. Thomas, the youngest, spoke last about his mobile response role, how he'd tracked the wounded guide through timber, the final shot that had completed their father's operation. Each brother's account corroborated the others with the precision of a military after-action report. By dawn on November 16, 2019, federal agents had assembled a case file that would reshape how law enforcement understood family-based domestic terrorism. The Whitmore family had surrendered without resistance, providing detailed confessions that read like tactical manuals rather than criminal admissions. Robert Whitmore died in federal prison 3 years later, never expressing regret for defending land his grandfather had claimed a century earlier. His sons remain incarcerated, their appeals exhausted, their legacy written in blood across 14 square miles of Montana wilderness. The disputed 43 acres still sits empty today, too stained by violence for any family to claim. A monument to the moment when frontier justice collided with federal law and left 11 families forever shattered. Some boundaries once crossed with bullets instead of lawyers can never be redrawn.